You know, in 2.5 hours, you could see Ariel Castro possibly confess to holding these 3 women in Cleveland in his house for a decade against their will. Well, a plea deal could spare the alleged victims from having to relive their experiences. But here's the thing, it would also spare him possibly from the death penalty. A family friend of Gina De Jesus says she wouldn't want to have to get up there and talk about what she went through in front of the court.
I don't think it will be fair for her to even show up in court. I don't think she wants to face him at all.
So you don't think she would want to face Ariel Castro at all?
You know, in my personal opinion, I don't think she would.
So what's behind a plea deal and what would that mean for the case? Well, Tanya Miller is a defense attorney and a former prosecutor. By the way, she's practiced in Ohio. She went to Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. So, Tanya, it's great to have you here. Appreciate it.
Great to be here, Robin.
Thank you. So why go ahead with a plea deal? I mean, this seems like it could be such an easy open and shut case for the prosecution.
Right. Well, trials are often very prolonged. If you try a case, there's always a chance that you might not get a conviction. And then you have the issue of appeals that could go on for years and years and years. If there's a mistake, the case could get reversed. It could come back. The victims would have to relive that over and over again. So this just gives certainty and finality to a case that has dragged on for so many years and hurt so many people.
But this would take the death penalty possibly off the table then.
Right.
I mean, is this an issue of money?
No, I don't
For the
think...
court system, meaning you don't have to spend the money if there's a plea deal, right? You're not going to go to trial at all.
Right. I mean, but I don't think that that's what's driving the train here. I think that the prosecution is really concerned about these particular victims. Yeah. These girls were held for over a decade, tortured and tormented by this guy. Going through a trial could potentially be very traumatic for them. And I think that the district attorney is very sensitive to that.
Hey, Tanya, what is with, in your opinion, what is with when we see Ariel Castro? The last time we saw him in court, his eyes weren't open. I mean, what is that about? His eyes were closed, and the judge even said, "Look at me."
Yeah, I don't know what that's about. He has his head down. Maybe it's in shame. Maybe he was living this double life. I mean, there were people who thought he was a nice guy, who thought he was a normal guy, and now he is essentially the monster. So there might be some shame, some guilt associated with that. He's all over
I know
national
you're not a
media.
psychologist.
I'm not a psychologist, but
that would be
I would hold my head down too. I mean, look, what did he do to these girls for 10 years? I mean, it's awful.
One of the controversial possible charges against him, there's like 977.
Right.
Involves murder involving the death of one of the women's baby fetuses.
Right.
But is that a law in Ohio? I mean, can you be charged with murder if a baby in pregnancy dies?
Yes.
See what I'm saying?
I do.
It could be a possible problem there.
I do. If you have committed an act that causes the death of a woman's fetus, you could be charged with homicide in Ohio. And it's not just Ohio. There are about 38 states that make that an actionable homicide offense.
All right. Tanya, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So this is at 10 a.m. Eastern. We're going to see what happens here. Will it be a plea deal, and will it take the death penalty off of the table? Right. You can watch right here on HLN. So this is Ariel Castro, the guy who's accused of holding 3 women when they were girls to begin with for 10 years in his home. About 1.5 hours from now, we could see Ariel Castro admit that, yes, he kidnapped 3 women and held them for what amounts to a decade in his home in Cleveland, Ohio. That's if his defense team and the prosecutors agree on what we hear is in the works, a plea deal. Tanya Miller is a defense attorney and a former prosecutor who, by the way, practiced in Ohio as well as went to college there. So, Tanya, can you tell us a little bit about what's going to happen? First off, there's 977, close to 1,000 charges.
Right.
So, I mean, how does this happen if there is a plea deal? Because we've heard that's in the work. Do we then see them in court?
Yes. I mean, if there's actually a plea deal, it could be to some of the counts. It could be to all of the counts, and certainly there would be a hearing where both parties sort of stand up there.
So they both have to show up, even if they've come to some agreement.
That's right. They both will be there. The plea will be taken in open court. The judge will have to accept the plea and then ultimately sentence the defendant.
I mean, you don't go through 977 charges, do you?
No, you
Are we going to sit through that?
No, you wouldn't read the actual counts. No, that's not necessary for the plea, but he may actually plead guilty to all 977 counts. We don't know.
One thing that's going to be strange to see, I think, at 10 a.m. Eastern, by the way, if you're going to tune in here, keep it on HLN, is his demeanor. Because it was so strange the last time that he was in court. It was almost like he was falling asleep. Now, I don't know if it's depression, if it's medicine, but what is going on there?
I have no idea. It looks to me like just sort of the walk of shame. You know, he's standing in front of these cameras. He's being held to account for these awful, horrendous things he did to these 3 innocent girls. It looks like he's holding his head down in shame, but we don't know. There might be some medication issue. There might be some mental illness there. We just don't really know, but it is very odd demeanor.
What are some of the things that the prosecution can do that really sets them up to be criticized here? Because, you know, I think people have been very supportive of law enforcement in Ohio as this came to light after the woman first escaped. But then the investigation itself came under fire because people were like, how did you miss so many different chances? And now, what could the prosecution do that would bring it under fire from the public?
Well, you know, it's very difficult when you're in this position as a prosecutor because you might not please everybody no matter what you do. There's some people who think that Ariel Castro should get the death penalty, that they should seek it, they should go all the way hard charging in this case and not concede anything. There are other people who think the opposite, that there should be some resolution to save the girls from having to come to court and testify. So they could potentially get criticized no matter what they do in this case. I just think they have to do what they think is reasonable and what the law supports.
And that is the trepidation that a lot of people think about, and that is of the 3 women having to stand in court before this man. And
absolutely.
So that's at 10 a.m. Eastern. We're going to see what is going to happen. Tanya, thank you.
Thank you.
And the hearing is at 10 a.m. Eastern right here on HLN. We'll take you there live to Cleveland. All right, about a half hour from now, Ariel Castro is expected to walk into a courtroom in Cleveland, possibly confess to keeping 3 women hostage in his house for a decade. One of the women, Amanda Berry, seen right there on the left, is the mother of Castro's 6-year-old daughter, and Tanya Miller is the defense attorney and a former prosecutor who practiced in Ohio as well. Tanya, you know, Castro has asked to see that little girl since he's been arrested here. I wonder if his push to see the little girl has anything to do with the plea talks that we hear about.
That's actually a good question. You know, as prosecutors, we do sometimes negotiate in a plea agreement a termination of parental rights. It's normally in the context where one parent has been abusive to the child or has been done violence to the child. So that could potentially be an issue that they were negotiating.
There's no chance, tell me, that this guy could have a plea deal where there is a chance of parole?
I don't see that. I really don't see that. I mean, perhaps the defense came to the table asking for that, but certainly the biggest sticking point is death in this case, not parole.
What else can they possibly negotiate in here? Like, can it be what kind of cell he's at? Can it be the type of prison where he is? Who can visit him? How much can you put in there?
Typically not that kind of stuff. You know, how a defendant is ultimately housed once he's convicted is within the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections. That's a separate institution from the district attorney's office. They do things their way, not normally part of a plea negotiation.
You know, when prosecutors come up with plea deals, is it in the back of their minds, especially in a case like this, in a community of Cleveland, Ohio, where people were so emotional when these women went missing and then were found. In the back of their minds, is there that, wow, this could cause a backlash? People may not want death penalty off of the table here.
I think that's definitely in the back of their minds. But, you know, prosecutors cannot govern themselves according to public opinion. They're not supposed to. They are governed by the rules of ethics, the evidence and the law in this case. And while that may be in the back of their minds, they have to do what's best for the victims in this case and what their evidence and proof will allow them to do.
Very good. Thank you so much, Tanya. So that's going to be in about half an hour. The hearing for Ariel Castro is something that we're going to show you here on HLN, so you can watch for that upcoming in a matter of minutes. A man from Utah who survived the horrific train crash that happened this week.
Wow. Tanya Miller, you're a defense attorney, former prosecutor. You've practiced in Ohio. Before we get into the technicalities of this plea deal, I mean, just hearing from those victims, I mean, does it hit you like it hits me? It's like, I don't know. It's heartbreaking.
It's very heartbreaking, and I'm sure that the prosecution took this into account when they decided whether or not they were going to take death off the table and offer Castro some kind of deal that would put him in prison for life. These girls have been through hell. 10 years being held captive by Ariel Castro, being tortured and raped repeatedly. You know, as a prosecutor, I've been a prosecutor, you do take into account what a trial would mean to the victim. Sometimes you have to trudge forward and move ahead. Some victims find it therapeutic to testify. Other victims find it just to be awfully traumatic, and I think that's probably played a role in the plea deal that we might see today.
Well, I would think so, right? Because this is such a unique situation, and this story not only captivated people here in the United States, but across the world, and they wanted to know about these women and how they were doing, and I think they were so amazed by that first picture we saw of Amanda Berry. Remember, in the hospital, and she's got her 6-year-old daughter, and she's smiling like she looks like, like a normal, happy young woman, and you know that's not how it's been for the past decade, right?
Right.
So a plea deal happens, they don't have to talk. You would think in a situation like this that that's like the most important thing on their minds.
I would think so. I mean, we saw that video that came out where they asked everyone to continue to respect their privacy, and how having that degree of privacy as they work their way through this trauma is so critical to them psychologically, I'm sure, to their families. So I absolutely think, I mean, 10 years of being tortured, that is just very unique for the prosecutors to have to consider, and I'm sure that the victims will be very happy if a plea deal can be reached in this case.
Okay, so what could prevent that from happening? Or is your gut telling you that's what's going to happen?
Well, you know, I think the biggest sticking point has been between the prosecution and the defense, this whole idea of whether or not the death penalty would be sought. Would the prosecutor be willing to take the death penalty off the table? Tim McGinty is known to be an aggressive prosecutor. He is a prosecutor's prosecutor, and I'm sure that when he indicated that he was considering seeking the death penalty, these defense attorneys and this defendant knew that he meant it. And so that, I think, has been a big sticking point. Also, I think strategically it's interesting. Many people have wondered why this case has gone forward for trial so quickly. In Ohio, they have this statutory speedy trial issue where, you know, the state has to bring a person to trial within 275 days, and if they're incarcerated, every day counts as 3 days, so essentially 90 days to try someone. With a case this big and this complicated, I'm sure that strategically that played a role in bringing both sides to the table.
Now, there may be a lot of people, especially within that community, because we saw the outrage, right? And there were people that wanted to track this guy down and kill him on the spot. Taking the death penalty away, do you think that could trigger, I don't know, a negative response because there's so many people that don't want to see this guy ever take another breath?
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm sure that in the back of the prosecutor's mind somewhere, he is an elected district attorney, he's a politician, so while he can't make decisions about charging based upon, you know, what the public necessarily wants, I'm sure that's in the back of his mind. But again, I think people have to understand that this is a very complicated and delicate process. The victims are of utmost importance in this consideration, and life without parole, many people view that as being a far better punishment for a guy like this. Make him live through and suffer every single day for the rest of his life, knowing what he did to these girls.
Yeah, that's a point well made, and a lot of times guys like that don't even survive prison.
That's true, too.
Things kind of take care of itself. Tanya, stay with me. We are going to continue to monitor these live pictures inside the courtroom. At any moment, we are expected for Ariel Castro to step up to that podium. A plea deal is what we're talking about now, taking the death penalty off the table. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Tanya, I mean, clearly there is a concern about this man's mental state, that when he does step up to that podium, and I'm sure the judge has to figure out, okay, he's supposed to, if there is a plea deal, he's got to plead guilty, but does this guy even know what he's doing and what he's saying, right? That has to be taken into account here.
Right. I mean, and the judge is going to make inquiries in that regard to protect the record, to make sure that this defendant's plea is voluntary, that he understands the nature of the charges against him, that he understands the advice that his attorney has given him, and that he wishes to waive those fundamental rights that he has to go to trial, to have his case proved beyond a reasonable doubt, and enter a guilty plea because it's in his best interest to do so. So the judge is going to have to make that finding.
All right, Tanya, stay with me. We are going to take another quick break. You are watching live coverage of the Ariel Castro hearing that should happen any moment now. As soon as he steps into that courtroom, you will hear exactly what happens. Possibly a plea deal is what we're hearing. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. And Tanya, she's talking directly to Gina because that was apparently one of her best childhood friends that she had no idea her father was holding captive in that home for 10 years. I mean, this guy has absolutely no support on the outside. It's going to be interesting to see what happens inside that courtroom today.
Yeah, you know, if you recall, the judge issued an order saying that this defendant could only contact by phone from the jail his mother and his sister. Now, we don't know exactly what prompted the court to enter that order, but some folks suspect that it may have been entered because Mr. Castro was trying to contact other family members in order to get their support from the jail, and they do not want to be contacted by him. So he definitely is one of the most hated men in Cleveland, possibly in the country at this very moment, and for good reason if these charges are true.
977 counts. Just from your experience, how unusual is that, and how complex does that become legally?
Yeah, that is pretty unusual, but this is an unusual case. And as a prosecutor, it's your job to prove each and every element of each and every count that you've charged in that indictment. So the fact that the prosecutor has sought 977 serious, complex felony counts against this defendant says a lot about what they think their evidence can prove in this case. So it's unusual, but appropriate, again, if what this man did, if he did what these women have said that he did to them all these years.
And just to bring our viewers up to date as they're tuning in for our special coverage and waiting for Ariel Castro to step up to that podium and say something. This is obviously file footage, but we do have cameras there in the courtroom. We are monitoring everything for you, and we'll take him when he steps in that courtroom. But just to quickly bring everybody up to date, Tanya, where we stood with regard to this case and where we are now and why we're paying such close attention to what could happen in just minutes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, this case is set for trial August 5th. They are supposed to start picking a jury in this case in a very short period of time. The prosecutors initially charged Ariel Castro with upwards of 300 counts involving this 10-year period where he kidnapped, raped repeatedly these 3 women. They re-indicted the case, adding additional charges. The prosecutor came forward after adding those charges, indicating that death was not off the table, that he was still considering the possibility of adding that death penalty specification in the indictment. But, you know, strategically, the defense did a very smart thing in this case. They held the prosecutor's feet to the fire by not waiving their right to speedy trial. So what that means is that the state had essentially 90 days to be ready to try Ariel Castro. Both sides strategically making moves, the state bringing death penalty to the table, the defense refusing to take their speedy trial off the table, hopefully indicating for a lot of folks who want to see this thing resolved in a way that doesn't require the women to come into court and testify, bringing both sides to the table to come to a plea deal, which would possibly mean that Ariel Castro spends the rest of his natural life in prison without the possibility of parole.
And we should know that within minutes. You're watching live coverage out of Cleveland there. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.